Hello, welcome back. Last week we talked about the opening of Atlantic trade and how things began. And of course, Atlantic trade would develop into the Atlantic slave trade, which is probably one of the most important and controversial subjects we're going to cover in this class. Um, as I think I mentioned last week, so I get this, we showed you maps like this where we have certain regions of Africa where people who were enslaved are being shipped out and into the Atlantic, some up to Europe, especially early on. But then after about 1500 or so, 1515 actually, we have increasing numbers of people taken to the Americas. And by Americas, I mean all of the Americas. North America, South America, the Caribbean, Mesoamerica, Mexico, etc. So pretty much everyone in every place was taking part in this. So once again, it starts after 1500, continues on till about 1850. And, most of this time period was a time when slavery was just considered normal. I mean, you had people in the story you'll read about Ayuba Suleiman Jallo. He objected to himself being enslaved, but for the most of this period, you don't have people speaking out against slavery in general. It was just considered to be part of life. We'll deal next week with the abolition and the ending. The major destinations for the Atlantic slave trade, the largest single destination, let me go back to the previous map, the largest single destination, as you can see by the width of these arrows here, was Brazil. As a group, then almost equaling Brazil would be the Caribbean, and then smaller places such as Spanish South America, Mexico, and this area that will become the United States. Most of the time it was British North America because it was before the Revolution. Anyway, the single largest driving force for the Atlantic slave trade, though, was sugar. About 90% of all slaves brought across the Atlantic ended up working somehow or another on a sugar plantation. Two reasons for that. One was there was a lot of sugar plantations, but secondly, the work was extremely difficult and they died. Life expectancy was so low that the plantation owners had to keep replacing their labor force of enslaved Africans. And now your textbook goes through and talks about why Africans and not Native or European, etc. And it starts fairly slowly, as you can see in a table like this one, or better yet on a graph like this. Where we see, relatively small numbers here for decades, and it's not really till after 1600. But the main years of the Atlantic slave trade are really 150 years, from 1700 to 1850. Okay, those are going to be the main years. A little earlier in some places like area of Senegal and Gambia and West Africa. And I'll have a little surge here after 1850 to Brazil and Cuba. But for the most part, we're talking the majority of people taken into the Atlantic slave trade are during this period right here. Right? Now, how do we know that? The fact is, we have a lot of sources. What you need to keep in mind is at the time, this was a legal business. Okay, we certainly consider it immoral, but it was through most of this period legal. So there's lots of business records. What kind of business records do we have? Here's a list of some, and I'll show you some in just a minute. Within Europe or the Americas, for the ship, we have purchase and registration documents. We've got hiring data for the crew, receipts and so on for cargo, letters between ship owners and suppliers, and so on. In Africa or along the coast, we've got letters, ship's logs, ledgers, journals, accountings, sometimes letters from African merchants or rulers. shipping manifests for enslaved Africans and commodities to Americas and Europe. On board the ship, we have letters and logs. In the Americas, we have sales documents, tax records, purchase documents, shipping manifests, newspaper ads, newspaper stories, plantation records, and then once again, letters and logs from captains or other officers on the ship or on the way home, wherever they started. Let me go back to, yeah, so once again, a classic African Atlantic slave ship voyage would start either in the Americas or in Europe. And the classic ones actually are in Europe. The English being the major slave trading nation for many, many years. So a voyage would start either in London or Liverpool, possibly Bristol here in Western England, come down to the West African coast, bring their cargo to trade for slaves, and then, whoops, I didn't want to do that, then traveling to a destination in the Americas, say someplace in the Caribbean or North America, or sometimes both, stopping along the way, selling the enslaved Africans, obviously, to plantations or other places, and then loading up on commodities, usually sugar or rice, and then taking that back to England. So that's the classic sort of triangular trade. The slave voyage once again could start in the Americas, it could start in North America or the Caribbean, and there was a large slave trade between Brazil and West Central Africa, just back and forth here, where those ships never went to Europe at all. Just back and forth here. And I mentioned the British, so I'm going to show you back to that table there. You see Great Britain here on this table, and for several years here, from 1700 to 1800, they are the largest slave trading nation in the world. Okay? That will change after 1800. We'll talk about that next week. All right. I want to show you a couple of maps here because I'm going to show you some documents, and you had one already, Gambia Slave Purchase 1. Well, where's Gambia? Gambia is a small country in West Africa, basically right along the Gambia River. Here's what that looked like back in the 18th century. Okay, this was not a major place for slave trading, but it was a convenient place for the British because sailing vessels could come down the coast and sail right up into the river here and conduct trade, which they did then for about 100, 150 years. Here's a more up-to-date map. The British had a fort right here on this island in the middle of the river called James Island, which they had rented that island from Numi, this kingdom right here that owned it. And they put a fort up, and you can see the island right there. This is a picture I took standing on the north bank of the river. You can see the island in the middle of the river, and this is a map of what the fort looked like. It's a castle. Basically, they built a castle, walls around it, to mostly to protect themselves from other Europeans. They were always battling with the French, anyway. It's here then that they had their trading headquarters, and they would trade up and down the river, and with people on the south bank and the north bank of the river. For both slaves and also other commodities. And then you see, sources like this one. This is from a journal that I copied in an archive in London. And you can see these are dated James Island. James Island. Well, James Island, once again, is that island right there. So these are records from British trade there in 1681. Okay. In this case, the top one is a cargo of commodities being put on board a ship. We have teeth, which means ivory, great ones, small ones, hides, and a small barrel of indigo. And then the second one is an invoice of slaves put on the ship. 52 men, 1 boy, and 13 women. And then food to feed them for the voyage to the Americas. They're going to Barbados in this case. in that voyage across the ocean then is known as the Middle Passage. In this case, they're being fed millet and rice. So how do we know about numbers and so on? Well, because we have documents like these. This one shows, I'm going to go back here, shows the 66 people they loaded on this ship. This document is for the same ship, but from Barbados, that shows who they sold the slaves to, the number, men, women, and boys that these people purchased, and how much they paid for it. And then accumulating, well, really thousands of documents like this allows us to put together numbers for the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so we can make an estimate then once again of about 12.5 million people who were put on ships on the African coast, and about 10.7 million people who made it alive to the other side. And the mortality rate then, if you do the math, it was between 14 and 15%. For the Middle Passage, because the conditions on the ships were horrific. They just were. There's no two ways around that, and it wasn't anything. I mean, the slave ship captains knew this, and they didn't sugarcoat it. They tried to hide it, but they didn't sugarcoat it. Anyway. So, and then we have, as I said, records in Africa itself, such as this one here, where the British Trading Company at the time, and this is from, once again along the Gambia River, purchased 5 men, 1 woman, and 1 boy in exchange for all of these goods. I should say also these 2 documents are ones I provided to you this week. This is one is labeled Coaster, and this one's Coaster 4. And so you can take a look at them yourself. And then here's a invoice then from Barbados, where the ship, also the coaster ship, same ship, after selling the slaves, loads up on sugar. And that's how much sugar they're carrying. Okay? Just once again to illustrate how many sources we have, the next, I think, 6 documents here are ones that I collected from a small archive in England, where a local merchant had invested in a slave ship in the 18th century, and these documents were saved by his family and saved in the archive. So the first document then is a list of the crew, their date they were hired, men's names, their quality or rank, and how much they're being paid, what their wages are. Right? The next document is a list of all the foodstuffs they put on board. This is then to feed the crew on the way out. Sailing then takes about a month to sail from England down to the West African coast. So this ship in particular is going to Gambia, and this is in 1755. This is also a shipping document showing the trade goods they're putting on board. 2 bales, 1 chest, 1 bale with merchandise, and then they're going to be stamped or branded with the initials of the owner, Benjamin Spencer here. And that's what you see up at top. If there's anything that tells you about how regular this trade was, it should be the fact that they're using fill-in-the-blank forms, right? That tells you that this is just a very common thing to do. You don't create a fill-in-the-blank form if you don't need hundreds or thousands of them, right? Okay? So this is going on, well, thousands and thousands of times. We have records on about 38,000 voyages. So it's a lot. I know the numbers are kind of mind-blowing in some cases. Anyway, so this is for this ship that's called I should have told you, this is a ship called the Cannon Hall. Cannon as in firing a cannon, and hall as in room. I don't know why. Anyway. Then we've got a letter from the ship's captain when they reached Antigua in the Caribbean. And then we have a document for the same voyage when they were in Charleston, South Carolina, loading up on rice and indigo. 58 barrels and 26 half barrels of rice. So this is a ship then that went to Gambia, purchased a number of slaves, then went to the Caribbean and to Charleston, South Carolina, sold the slaves, loaded up on rice, mostly in this case, and then sailed back to England. And then here is another document showing the merchandise. Oh, this is the merchandise they shipped out to trade with. We have cloth, silver, coral, rings, some more cloth, chest lock. Anyway, just a number of goods and they were sending out. Okay. I want to deal with a number of myths about the Atlantic slave trade, because if there's any subject that there's myths and misinformation out there, it's about this. I've dealt with it somewhat already by talking about numbers. You see numbers of 50 million, 100 million, or whatever, and that's just not possible. There weren't enough ships around. So we think the estimate of 12.5 million people put on ships on the African coast is a pretty good estimate. There's also a myth, and this was perpetuated by the first TV show of Roots, if you've seen that, when they showed Europeans directing the kidnap of Africans and then taking them into slavery. Did it happen? Yes, it happened, especially very early on, and it would happen a time or two throughout, but for the most part, no. Europeans and Americans did not kidnap 12 million Africans. Okay, it's just not possible. If you accepted that, then you would have to accept that Africans were so weak to allow 12 million of them to get kidnapped, or so dumb that they couldn't move away from the coast. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And how do we know that? Well, once again, we have records, right? Like this one I gave you. Gambia Slave Purchase 1 is how this is labeled. And I know you probably have a hard time reading it. So I'll tell you what this says. So this is sundry accounts directed to Garagia Factory. Once again, this is along the Gambia River. Well, you can see at the top there, it says Gambia, September 27th, 1734. So 18th century. And these are the goods given to a local merchant for one slave purchase. Right? 3 guns, 5 iron bars, 4 pounds of gunpowder, 10 pounds of lead balls, that's ammunition for the guns, 3 cutlasses, which are a type of sword, 1 pistol, 1/4 piece of long cloth, which is what it says, cloth is long, 1 ounce of coral, and 6.5 gallons of rum. Okay. Now, a lot of people reading this document misread it, because I've used this in class a number of times. They think it says 39 slaves. Well, it does say 39 slaves, but 39 is actually the accounting category the company uses. Okay, slaves are number 39. Okay, you have to read, so it says slaves, comma, 1 man cost the following goods. Okay, so think about that. These trading companies have to go, well, really around the world getting these goods, manufacturing them and buying them, shipping them down to Africa to purchase enslaved Africans. 1 person cost all these goods. And let me show you what that looks like just here. Okay, this is what these goods are. So the 3 cutlasses, 3 guns, a pistol, the 6.5 gallons of, that's the rum up there. There's the gunpowder, cloth, beads, etc., etc. Okay, because a lot of people ask, they don't believe that that Africans were selling slaves. They like to believe the kidnapping myth because they don't believe Africans would sell other Africans. Well, okay, that's not the way Africans thought about it. I mean, we don't think about it that way here either, right? I mean, you hear a news story about a shooting in Chicago. Do you say, How could one Chicagoan do that to another one? Well, no, we don't really think in those terms. Um, and for the most part, people who were enslaved are people from outside your own society. All right. Um, but this also illustrates why the slave trade took place, and why African merchants and kings and so on would take part in it. Because they can get a lot of stuff. Okay? I mean, that's just the bottom line. This is all the stuff you can get by selling one person. So imagine the accumulation of stuff for 12.5 million people, right? Well, just multiply this by 12 million. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Okay, and it can make you wealthy pretty quickly. Okay? Now, of course, that's for the merchants and elites. The common people, not so good, because they're the ones being preyed upon. Of course, they're the ones being potentially enslaved. So they're not so happy about that. Of course. Well, here's another document from along the Gambia River that shows a future slave purchase. Okay, this is a list of goods given her to the Emperor of Phoney. Well, where's Phoney? Let me show you on the map here quickly. Sorry, I got to go back through a few things here. There we go. Phoney is right here, just south of James Island. Okay, so the English are here. They're trading, and they want to keep good relations with the locals, including the emperor here. He was a close ally of theirs. So what do? To the Emperor of Phoney, lent him to be paid one merchantable slave. So they gave him all this stuff, or lent it to him, and he's got to provide them at some later point a slave. Okay? 20 pounds of gunpowder, 1 gun, 2/3 yard of red cloth, 2 gallons of brandy, 1 printed cloth, 200 gun flints, 10 pounds of ball, okay, once again, ammunition, 5 iron bars, and 2 cutlasses for 1 person, right? Why would he do that? Well, as I said, to get this kind of stuff, right? Obviously, the weapons are valuable and useful, not only for military purposes, but also for defense and so on. Iron bars is an important resource. Now, one thing you'll notice if you look at the list of goods in both of these lists here, not much cloth. Cloth was the number one item brought to Africa to purchase slaves. But it's not the same every place. And along the Gambia River, people didn't want European cloth or even Indian cloth or any other kind of cloth. They like making their own. So you don't see much cloth in these transactions. You know, you see 2/3 of a yard, you see 1 cloth, but that's not much. You can tell by the values. They wanted other things. They wanted iron. They wanted weapons. They want alcohol. Those are the main things they want. And this is a list then of that factory at Garagia, where that Gambia slave purchase document was from, of all the stuff they have to keep an inventory to purchase, well, slaves and commodities. You know, we've got guns, beads, iron bars, 3 or 4 kinds of cloth, 2 types of swords, hats, copper rods, handkerchiefs, cowrie shells, gunpowder, blue cloth, Manchester cloth, brass pans, amber necklaces, lead ball, gun flints, pistols once again, bells, what else? Paper, coral, more bells, another kind of cloth, more beads, 3 pair of silk slippers, 1 pair of leather slippers, 2 felt hats. I mean, just all sorts of stuff. The slave ships coming to West Africa were basically department stores on the way there. Once they've conducted trade and left Africa, then they're prisons. They're prisons for enslaved Africans. So they start out being a warehouse, basically, of trade goods, and then they turn into a prison. And then once again, when they get to the Americas, they become a warehouse again to carry sugar, rice, and so on back to Europe. Okay. Now I want to deal with the number of specific myths I think that people have. So there's this myth that slave ships, that people were enslaved in Africa, brought to the coast and kept there, and then the ship pulls up and people just load in, load them up and go. That's not how it worked. And if you look at this, and you should look at this on a computer, hopefully, but this is a table I made, once again, from ships 18th century along the Gambia River, and how long they spent in the river conducting trade. The shortest one is 62 days. That's 2 months. The longest one is 320 days. That's 11 months, right? Almost 10 and a half months. It took, let's go back. They're usually buying slaves 1 or 2 at a time. So like those transactions I showed you, sometimes more. It takes months to be there to fill up a ship. Okay. So there's not, it's different in different places, but for the most part, you don't have masses of people just, slaves waiting along the shore to be loaded onto ships. Actually, the ships are there for months and months and months at a time. One result of that actually is the crew start to die from malaria, yellow fever, tropical diseases. And as a matter of fact, the crew mortality rate was actually higher than the slave mortality rate. Mostly because they're along the coast for so long getting sick. Okay. There's also this myth that slave captains packed in extra slaves to account for deaths. Not true. Take a look at this here. This is a table, once again, 18th century along the Gambia River. We know because we have documents. The ship owner will tell the captain, go, he'll write out instructions. Say, go and buy 200 slaves for this ship and then take them to wherever, South Carolina, Jamaica, Brazil, whatever, right? So we have documentation. We know how many slaves they intended to buy. And then we know how many they ended up with, okay? And in most cases, as we see here, almost all of them, it's a smaller percent. There's only one ship on this whole list that has more slaves. They intended to buy 200, they bought 210, right? Every place else, they ended up with 69% of what they intended, 51%, 67%, 72, 78%, 73%, 73%, and then 85%. So the fact is, the vast majority of slave ships leaving the African coast aren't full. What happens typically is they're there for, as I showed you in the previous one, a long period of time, and the crew start dying. And the captain has to make a choice, because the more crew that die, the greater chance of the slaves rising up against them, because there's not as many, because the crew on a slave ship are essentially prison guards, right? If the guards start dying off, then the slaves start looking around saying, hey, I think we can take over. So the captain, of course, doesn't want that. So he will take off before the ship is full in order to safeguard, the slaves he has on board, because the risk of rebellion was very great, actually. That's the next point. There's a myth that Africans didn't resist the slave trade. And in fact, up to 10% of all voyages had at least an attempted uprising. It is true that you don't have many uprisings that are successful if you define success as getting back to Africa. But I don't think that was their goal. For the most part, their goal was to prevent being sold into the Americas. And if they died along the way, that was preferable to making it into slavery. And especially when the ships along the African coast, because they don't want to leave Africa. Probably, well, obviously a lot of reasons, but even they want to die, they prefer to die in Africa than to live as a slave in the Americas, because if they die in Africa, they have a better chance of becoming an ancestor, which is a major goal, the spiritual beliefs being what they are. You die overseas, then you're lost. Your soul is lost. So you had actually a lot of uprisings. I think there's a list of almost 700 or so that we have records on, which is quite a bit. Anyway, now what's going on within Africa? How are people becoming enslaved? Well, that we don't have great sources on because, for the most part, Europeans are kept along the coast and they're not going into the interior. So the African merchants and so on are bringing groups of slaves to them, and they don't necessarily know how people are being enslaved. We do have this one guy from 1850 who interviewed 179 former slaves and asked them, how did this happen to you? And it broke down like this. About 30% were enslaved due to warfare. Well, what does that mean? Usually, scholars define it as warfare if it's not warfare intended to produce slaves. If it's warfare for another purpose, okay, like just two kingdoms fighting, okay, like we're happened in Europe throughout the centuries, right? 34% then is just straight on kidnapping, usually armed groups raiding their neighbors. Okay? 11% of the people were enslaved due to debt. People get into debt, they can't pay it, and then the person they owe the money to is able to enslave them or one of their family members and sell them off. Right? 7% of people enslaved due to judicial action, which means they're convicted of a crime, and the sentence was enslavement. And then 7% of people were sold by a family member or a superior, like local chief or king or something like that. Usually there's an underlying reason for that. A chief or a king actually might sell off somebody who is a political opponent. That's possible. But when it's a family member, it's almost always due to some sort of hardship like a famine. Okay? You just can't, you don't have enough food to feed everybody. So, it's a very hard choice. What do? You said let everybody die, or maybe you sell off one family member, use some of the money to buy enough food to keep everybody else alive. And frankly, that's a choice that's still going on in the world today. So that's what's happening from what we know within Africa, for the most part. Okay. What's the impact on Africa of all of this? Well, that's also controversial, and scholars are not totally in agreement on this. But let's look at a number of things here. First off, demographic. Okay, what's the impact on population? Because you're taking 12 million people out, right? 2/3 of them men. But not just people, but basically the prime people of your society. You're taking, because the slave traders along the coast want people who are 15 to 30 years old. So those are, the prime people who are going to be producing for your society, right? So you're losing that potential, but also just the population. There was a scholar at Boston University who did a computerized study of demographics, looking at populations and so on, and he estimated that had African societies not lost these 12 million people to the Atlantic slave trade, 12.5 million people, then their population would have been about 50 million more by 1900 than it was. So in other words, it obviously undermined the development of population in Africa. That is a portion of the next point, which is economic, because people are a major resource in economic production, right? We're always looking at the jobs report and stuff like that. Okay, unemployment rates and so on. And so losing these productive individuals had a distinct impact on economic development in Africa. Okay, a negative impact, no doubt about that. There was probably also a secondary negative impact from all the goods that were brought in. Why? Well, because Africa then doesn't develop industries like Europe. Why not? Well, because they're getting these goods from Europe, largely. So it tends to undermine local production of goods. Right? And most of these goods then that are being brought in are not ones that contribute to economic development. We see also negative social changes in marriage and family, for example, because once again, you're losing these 15 to 30-year-old people. What does that do? Well, one of the things it does, especially the societies along the coast, because you're losing, once again, 2/3 of the people are men, 1/3 are women. So you're losing a disproportionate number of men. So you have the development of polygyny, or men having multiple wives, because there's essentially a surplus of women in the society. So that leads to family changes. Also, a phenomenon of older men marrying younger women, because that 15 to 30-year-old male group is, a lot of them are gone. Okay, so you have men in their 40s and 50s marrying, well, girls really who are in their teens or early 20s. And then we have, numerous cultural changes as well. But we also see a change in legal systems. Let me go back to this. I talked about people being enslaved because they're convicted of a crime. Well, that wasn't always the punishment, but it changes over time because so many Europeans, Americans are coming to the African coast expressing a demand for slaves. Corrupt elites in Africa basically changed the laws, and everything now is punishable by enslavement. So let's say it used to just be murder would be, you would be punished by being enslaved and sold off away from your society, right? But now every little offense, all the way down to petty theft, no matter what happens, if someone's convicted or even accused, they're sold off. So we see changes in legal systems across the continent because of the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade has a number of negative effects. Of course, we're dealing with, I'm not doing U.S. history, but we of course are dealing with negative effects in our own societies with racism, right? There's no doubt this didn't start out necessarily as a racial system, but of course it becomes one, because who's being enslaved are only people of color, Africans. So we certainly see that in every society in the Americas. But the impact on Africa is also great in many ways, in the four here that I've enumerated here. Okay, that's what I wanted to cover for this lecture for the week. Thank you very much.